research, help farmers and ranchers with research, education, and mentorship. And that's one thing we've noticed that's a huge deal for people, is that true mentorship of like-minded people that are doing the same things you are doing, that you can go to and listen and learn from and have their support. And so that's one big thing that we really promote. Our focus is mainly on grazing land, so livestock, land, but also your livelihood as a producer. Because we recognize if you're not profitable, you're not in business long. And so it's not only about the soil, it's not only about the livestock, it's about your well-being as a producer and helping you turn your operation into a true business. We've worked side by side with producers for 80 years now. Our founder, Lloyd Noble, was a very successful oil man. And even though he was in oil, he recognized what farming practices had done to the landscape. And that's why he started the Noble Research Institute in 1945, was to focus on soil. And so we have went through a lot of changes the last really 5 years, where we were focused only in southern Oklahoma, North Texas, was very conventional in our management. 5 years ago, with a new CEO, our board is ran by family members of Lloyd Noble. They decided to change back and do why do we exist, and that was all about soil health. And now, instead of being focused just in Oklahoma and North Texas, we are national. And so we are going out, educating, doing research across the entire nation now. Our mission is to guide farmers and ranchers in applying regenerative principles that yield healthier soil, more productive grazing lands, and again, that business success, because we know that's so important for you. We realized, and our founder realized it early on, and it took us a few years to actually come back to this, but there is life in the soil. And as producers, we have to understand or realize what is our practices that we're doing on a daily basis, how is that impacting that life in that soil. Whenever I was in college, we never talked about life in the soil. It was just a media to grow your forage or your plants. The last 10, 12 years, we've learned so much about what's going on in the soil, it's changed our perspective. I heard this the other day from a researcher. Today, we only know 10% of the microbes that's in the soil. So it is truly the new frontier for us as researchers. And for me as an educator, to educate you guys, how do we embrace those microbes? How do we get those to flourish to help us be more profitable? And so that's what we're trying to do. So I know everybody's heard the term regenerative, right? It's been a big buzzword the last few years. And so what does that truly mean? Well, we looked it up. If you just Google regenerative ag usually is, one of the definitions is usually restoring degraded soils through management practices. And we see a lot of organizations that their sole focus is only on the soil. And for us, that's not good enough. We want to take it a little farther. Well, what does Alan Williams with Understanding Ag, he takes it that step farther, regenerative grazing. But again, that is restoring degraded soil through grazing practices. You just look up the definition of regenerate, that is to recreate, restore, reflourish, but usually associated with the soil. But one thing, if you look at the Cambridge definition on the internet, it is to improve a system. And this is the approach we take, because we realize it's not just one piece of the puzzle. We want to manage the entirety of your operation, from the grass, from the soil, the livestock, but also your people, your community, because it all plays a factor. And this is part of that ecosystem processes. And so we do this regenerative ag through improving and understanding our challenges or our limitations with the ecosystem processes. These are our 4 ecosystem processes that really controls everything that goes on in nature. It's the energy cycle. That's the capturing the sunlight, that free sunlight, capturing it with the green leaves, going through photosynthesis, creating carbon that drives the entire cycle. The water cycle. Now, you guys in Louisiana are a little bit blessed with more rainfall than I am in Oklahoma, but you still go through droughts. I heard that this morning. How can we increase our water capture when we do get it and use that for later in the season? That's that water cycle. We want a functioning water cycle. And to me, that water cycle is really what drives the entire system, because without water, we can't grow grass to capture sunlight. The nutrient cycle. Our microbes are there. Mother Nature gives us those microbes that can create all the nutrients that we need. We have to feed them and make sure they're flourishing. And we can use our livestock to do that. We know over time, our soils in the U.S. was created along with bison. And so as we talk about here in a little bit, we'll talk about regenerative grazing. What we're trying to do is mimic bison grazing, the way our soils was developed over centuries with the bison. And then that community dynamics. This kind of rose everything up. The diversity, the plant diversity, the animal diversity, the insect diversity, the wildlife, but also our people, our communities. And so these are our guiding lights, these ecosystem processes. And so we like to say, let principles guide you, not prescriptions. I know myself as going through college, I love best management practices. But if best management practices don't work for you, you need to use principles, because what works for you doesn't necessarily going to work for your neighbor. And so you need to understand what's going to work for you and learn from those failures, because we're all, as an ag producer, we all go through challenges. We all have failures. I like to say there's no such thing as a failure, because every failure is a learning opportunity. If I'm open-minded enough to realize what happened and why, I can make a change and improve that. And so in our classes, we talk a lot about observations, the skills of observation. If you are in the right mindset to see what's actually going on, you can make those changes. And so nothing is ever a failure, because I'm constantly improving on what I'm seeing based on my own observations. But those principles that we are following are the 6 soil health principles. How many of you guys have seen the 6 soil health principles? Hopefully most of you in the class raise your hands. That's great. One of the ones that is a little different than a lot of people use is this know your context. And to me, know your context is a lot more than just your environment, your climate, your rainfall. I actually like what Ted said this morning. It's your resources. What do you have? What forages are you working with that is naturally occurring on your place? Last night, Butch and we went out and ate, and Butch was talking to me. He took one of our courses, and he said that was the one thing he took out of that course was use what he already had. He didn't have to go and buy something. Use what you have. And that's as part of your context. The other big one for me is the people. The people skills, you yourself as a manager or landowner, but also who works for you. If their willingness to learn and the knowledge that they bring to the table. And if you want to have that open mindset to make sure that you are all on the same page and working towards a common goal. When we talk about cover the soil, I loved what Ted showed, how he mentioned, he's trampling most of that forage that he's growing there. The animals are utilizing just a small percentage of it, but what he's actually doing is feeding the microbes in the soil with what he's leaving. The other big one is when we do get a rainfall, leaving that forage, that material on the surface. We're actually allowing that water to infiltrate into the soil faster, and so we're not having as much runoff. We're also storing that water. Those roots, as he mentioned, that's the aeration. Those are creating channels that's allowing that water to be soaked into the soil. The other big one is it helps moderate our soil temperatures. I work in pecan orchards out in the west, like West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and I have seen temperatures on bare soil in April, whenever it's only 85 degrees outside, the soil temperature is over 140 degrees. What's that doing to our livestock or our life under the soil? It's killing it. And so those soils are totally void of any beneficial microbes in that soil. And so they have to do expensive inputs that in today's environment is not cost effective. And the other big one on covering the soil that I'm really passionate about, because I did not learn this in school, was evaporation. I was taught evaporation occurred on bodies of water. Never talked about evaporation off of bare ground. We can actually see 30 to 60% more water or moisture loss through bare soil than we actually do off of bodies of water. So I want you to think about that. If I have bare soil in my pastures, how much of that water that I am capturing am I actually losing? That if I could keep that covered, even if it's with residual that my animals have trampled, I can store that and use that for later whenever I do go through those droughty periods. Here's an example that we worked with a producer. It'll be a little different than you guys because he's in southwest Oklahoma. Very dry. I think rainfall is about 16, 17 inches per year. But the producer on the left had started following soil health principles, changed from continuous farming, and he was grazing. But this was about 3 years after he really started focusing on soil health in his grazing management. And this was over about an 8-day period. He got 5.3 inches of rain. And if you look at the photo, his neighbor, who is continuous wheat after wheat after wheat, and if he doesn't have wheat growing, it's fallow the rest of the year. And the biggest thing you see here is he doesn't have hardly any standing water on the left side, while his neighbor has water just standing there. And again, that evaporation off that water we're losing. This is actually behind the houses back here is a creek, and so it's a lot of it's flowing down, eroding that pasture. The other thing I want you to look at is the color of that water. It's taking the topsoil, the nutrients with it. And the interesting thing, so a little management here. On the right side was conventional, no cover crops, no grazing. We went out and done a test, took soil cores, and figured out that the infiltration rate on that right side was 0.6 inches of water per hour was what the infiltration rate was. That soil could only hold a little over 16,000 gallons of water per acre because of the management that they were doing on that property. While the producer on the left side, he was no-till crop, planted cover crops, had a planned grazing management. He was running lots of stockers and cows on this operation. His infiltration rate was 2.9 inches per hour, and he stored over 78,000 gallons of water. And in his environment, that's crucial because they go through long periods of drought. That's almost a 400% increase in stored water. The other thing that I think was interesting is 2 days after this picture was taken, he went in and no-tilled this side. same soil types. I want you to think about how long it would take this to dry out so you could put equipment in there without rutting it up. I believe he said it took about 4 weeks before they could get in there, and they still left ruts. And his place was already greening up, and he was preparing to start putting up fence because he knew he was going to be able to graze it. This is the power of following these principles. Next principle is minimize soil disturbance. I thought Ted done a great job this morning talking about even our grazing is a disturbance, but it's a natural disturbance. But we want to minimize it, optimize it. There are reasons we want that disturbance to help break up the crust of the soil if we have bare grounds. It can also, the hoof impact can actually aerate the soil and stimulate root growth for our plants. What we want to do is try to eliminate or reduce our unnatural disturbances, such as tillage, chemicals, synthetic fertilizers. I'm not saying they're bad, we just want to minimize them. They're still a tool that we can use if we need to, just be thinking about what's the consequences if I use this. And also always think about the business side of it. What's this going to cost me? Next one is maintaining continuous living roots in the soil. There's nowhere in nature that we have a monoculture. And so if you have a monoculture, you only have roots, living active roots for a certain period of time. Even if they're a perennial plant, they're still alive, but they're not functioning while they're dormant. So we want to have continuous roots as long as we possibly can to help us increase that water infiltration. But the other big thing for me as a scientist is those roots are actually excreting, we call them exudates, releasing carbons into the soil that are feeding our microbes. And the more diversity we have with those roots, the more diversity of microbes we have. The other nice thing as a grazer, this allows us to graze longer in the year because we have different growing seasons with our forages. So we're not focused just in one growing season. We've got green plants out there as long as we possibly can. And this brings us into that increased diversity. To me, that diversity of plants that's feeding the diversity of microbes is, to me, is the biggest key. Each plant only puts out certain types of exudates, and those exudates only feed certain microbes. And so the more diversity of plants, the more diversity of microbes. But it's not just about the plants. It's about the livestock. It's about the wildlife, the birds, the insects that we have out there. I can't remember the exact number, but I believe it's somewhere for every one harmful insect, there's over 300-400 beneficial insects. So we have trained ourselves to look for those harmful insects that we want to kill. We don't think about all those other beneficials that whenever we go out and we do spray for that one thing, we're trying to kill, how many other things are we eliminating that has a potential for us to help us with our overall production. And then the last soil health principle is integrating livestock. And like I said, I work with a lot of pecan growers in most orchards. That's a really hard one for a lot of people to get around, but there is power behind those livestock. Number one, there are mowers. They're helping us control the forage that's in the soil or in our pastures. But they're also our money generator. And remember I said earlier, profitability, success is key for us, because if you're not profitable, you won't be in business long. And so livestock is our tool that we are using to improve our soil health, but it's also the thing that we're getting the money for. And so we want to encourage introducing livestock. The other thing about microbes is if you are grazing a ruminant animal, whether it be a sheep, a cow, even deer, those are ruminants. Goats, The same microbes that are in their stomachs is a similar microbe that's in the soil. So every time we're grazing, we're inoculating our soil with new microbes. And so if we do it properly, we can actually increase that inoculation of soil microbes through our animals. And, you know, we do want to look at diversity of our livestock. This goes back to that context. I grew up stalker operation, cow-calf. There's no way I would ever do sheep growing up, but there is benefits to that. If you're in the mindset, it's like, I will never have sheep or goats, that's fine. Just understand that could add another level to your success if you did do that. But if you're not in the right mindset or your context is in a certain situation, you can't or won't do it, that's fine. I will say this, I love insects. Actually, I had a grad student 2 years ago that was looking at dung beetles. And one thing we did notice, every place we had sheep grazing, our dung beetle populations was about 200 to 300 times greater than just cattle alone. And that's a huge difference. The big one is hogs. Just side note, they actually use hog dung to trap the dung beetles because they're most attracted to pig manure. So we realize that a healthy soil is important, and it is a stronger bottom line, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. And that's what we want you to think about. And so at Noble, we've taken this approach that as we're educating producers, it's not only the livestock or the soil. This is our ranching philosophy. It has to do with the livestock, the land, the business, the finances, the community. Because if you are successful, if you're profitable as a producer, it bleeds over into the community that you're in. I think the great example is White Oaks Pasture with Will Harris in Georgia, where what he is doing with his operation, he has flourished his community. A community that actually almost disappeared until he got into this, and now he has a flourishing community around him. It's not just his success, it's success for the entire community around. And then that last piece is the people, because we understand that without the people, we have no business. And so these are the areas that we try to teach in each one of our classes. And eventually, it takes us a while to develop a class, but eventually we will have courses developed around each one of these philosophies. Successional planning is a huge one. I know I grew up, we leased a lot of property, lots of big ranches to run stalker cattle on, and I can tell you, I have seen over and over again as the grandfather or the dad passes away, the next generation's not in place to take over the operation. I worked for years on a large operation, 14,000 acres, very profitable operation. And the owner, whenever he passed away and had a bunch of money, the nephews came in and within 5 years lost it all because there was no planning that took place. And so we are actually partnering with Oklahoma State University on successional planning because we see that as a big void for a lot of producers. The other one is young people come into agriculture that can't afford to get in, buy land or the livestock or their equipment. How do they get into this? Because without young people coming in, we're all getting older, who's going to take our place? And so we recognize that that's a big issue, challenge for us into the future in the ag industry. So whenever we look at, and I stole this from Ranching for Profit, but if you look at the pot, it's a three-legged pot. Why is it a three-legged pot, not a four-legged? Have you ever tried to set a four-legged pot on a slope? It's easier to tip over, right? A three-legged pot's very sturdy. Well, we look at it this way in agriculture, is those three legs is our land, our livestock, and our money. Where a lot of institute or organizations forget about is the people. That's part of that structure. And we got to make it people like us, so we got to throw a cowboy hat on them. So, as I said earlier, we don't teach just about soil health because soil health focused doesn't necessarily guarantee financial gains. Marrying ecological efficiency to production principle or practices reduces the friction within our operation that allows us to become more successful. And we actually make Mother Nature our partner. We don't fight her, because if we fight Mother Nature, we're always going to lose. She bats last. And that's something we've always been taught, and that's the model of agriculture, is we try to control what Mother Nature does. We can't do it, especially not in today's economical environment. So here's a scenario one of our facilitators put together, and it kind of goes along with the last talk, and I think the numbers are kind of similar with this scenario. So let's just say you decided that you were going to go and you had a cow herd that you weren't going to do anything with, no management. You're just going to leave them and see what happens. What do you think your conception rate would be? What was that? It'd be pretty low, right? Let's say 30%. It's pretty realistic. So as a manager, I would tell myself, well, that's not efficient enough for me. I can't make a living at this. So I'm going to add a little management. Maybe to get it up to 60%. That management might be I'm feeding them just a little bit. But still 60% probably not efficient. So I'm going to add a little bit more. Maybe I'm feeding more hay. Because I've got too many animals out there, I'm having to supplement my forage. I still want a little bit more. I want to get up in that high 70% conception. So I'm feeding mineral. Well, I need to get up to average 85%. But lip tubs or whatever you want out there, to get close to where the industry standard is, high 80% conception. Maybe I'm vaccinating, I'm deworming, whatever the practice is. This is the paradigm that we've been in the ag industry for years. My question to you is, what does each one of these cost you? And is it beneficial to you? Is it profitable? And at what level do you, as a manager, realize what is the most profit I can gain? Is it at 60%? Is it at 80%? I know through school I was taught that increased production always equaled increased profit. Is that true? So we teach in our profitability, actually in all of our classes, to look at profit per acre. Because whenever you put it on a per acre basis, you can look at apples to apples, and you can actually look at what am I doing, what's it costing me, and can I do away with it? And is it still going to increase my profit? And lots of times, even if we have less animals out there grazing, I can be in selling less beef, I can be more profitable than somebody who's putting a lot of inputs into their operation because of the cost of their inputs. And so we do have a profitability class, and I'm not going to go into it because it would take the whole time to explain it all, but it's typical, where does your profit come from? And how do we become more profitable? Is that by reducing input cost? I want you to think, there is a point, if I reduce too many inputs, it will hurt my production, which will also limit or limits my ability for a good profit. There's a diminishing law of returns. I will be honest with you, whenever Noble started, we took a stance on our own ranches. We have almost 14,000 acres of ranches that we manage and own, and we recognize that producers can't do it because they can't be profitable. We can, so we went cold turkey, no inputs whatsoever, and the only thing we're doing is managing the livestock. But what we want to do is see how long does it take the soil to recover to become profitable again, because we recognize you guys can't do that. And it was a disaster, absolute disaster. We crashed our system. It was a learning opportunity for us. But again, we knew we could do it when you guys couldn't, so we will be able to use that for research purposes to show you guys how to improve your soils over time and get there quicker so you're more profitable. We already talked about increasing production. Increasing production usually comes at a cost. As long as you understand what that cost is, that's fine, but usually to a point, it becomes less effective for you. The other thing, whenever you're talking about profit, and I love what Ted said this morning, is that diversity. Those broilers, those layers, the honeybees, sheep. Can I diversify? I will warn you, don't get so diverse that you've got so many things going on that you can't manage it all. I see that a lot with producers. They try to do too many things and then they get overwhelmed. So slowly, as you add more enterprises, think about what you're doing to make sure you're not overloading yourself. In our profitability classes, we talk about this typical, your break-even point, your direct cost, your overhead. A lot of times, folks will tell you got to lower your overheads to be more profitable. But sometimes if we lower those overheads, we hurt our production. Or if we lower our input costs like we did at Noble, we do hurt our production. We hurt our carrying capacity because we ended up being overstocked and we had to destock quite a bit. But understanding the financials is important to you to be successful. The other thing we like to tell people is get better before you get big. In our classes, we use terminology. It's called the safe to learn approach. Try something small, see how it works, learn from the mistakes, and build off of it. It's all about the observations that you have, because that's where the greatest knowledge comes from. It's not from me standing up here teaching you. It's your own experiences. That's where the true knowledge is gained. Think about how I scale that. Make your business great before you make it grand. Too many people try to go in and make a grand business, and normally they fail. You want to make sure that you are good as a business manager, because as a ranch manager or a ranch owner, that's what you should be. Think of yourself as a business owner. Growing more feed doesn't necessarily mean or guarantee a better bottom line. If I'm putting the money into growing more forage, I'm probably hurting myself in most instances. So this goes back to that. Think about it, profit per acre, not production. And we like to say the best range nutritionist is a great grazer. I think Ted said it. Don't drive through your pasture in your side-by-side. Walk through your pasture. Make those observations. Whenever you start looking at things differently, you start seeing things differently. My son's 12 now, but I loved, about 4 years ago, we were moving animals, and like I said, I love insects, and so I was digging through the dung looking for dung beetles. And we had just opened a new paddock, moved the cows in, and he goes, "Dad, come here, is this what you're looking for?" I went to the pile, And I started digging through it, and it's like, nope, no dung beetles. I overlooked all the pill bugs that was on this pile. He seen it, I didn't, because I wasn't looking for it. I've got a photo I can show you. That pile wasn't 5 minutes old, and it had 200-300 pill bugs on it. And once he kept questioning me, I started to realize what he seen, because I did not see it at first. Took a photo, sent it to a friend of mine that's an entomologist. Was like, I didn't know this occurred. I didn't know roly-polies broke down done. And his first response back to me is, it doesn't. And then about an hour later, he texted me back and goes, it's not in the books, but they are a decayer. You're grazing under trees with lots of litter, leaf litter. And they're meant to just break down carbon, and dung is a carbon source. And so that's what you're seeing. Books said it didn't happen, that they didn't eat manure, but they sure was. And so now as I go out, I try to get in a child's mind. Because children see things because they're not going out with a notion to see a certain thing like we are as an adult. They're open-minded. They don't know what to expect to see. So if you go out with that type of mindset, you'll start noticing so many things that's different. And to me, this is what puts fun back into agriculture. Because every day I go out, I see something different. Because I'm not expecting to see the weeds or the bare soil. I'm going out there actually observing what's going on. The other thing we say is the best ranch manager is a great businessman. If you don't turn your ranch into a business, you're failing yourself. And eventually your business will suffer. We teach a lot about carrying capacity. And this might be a little different than what you guys are familiar with, but we've recognized over the last 3 years teaching these courses, most people don't understand what carrying capacity really is. Carrying capacity is what your land can support animal-wise. A lot of times we do this based on precipitation. You have these 3 herds. Where do you determine your carrying capacity? Is it down here during the drought years? Or up here when you're getting plenty of rainfall? If you be true to yourself, you really need to be in this middle and looking for opportunities to increase your profit whenever we do have abundant grass. But I'm also not struggling when I'm going through those drought years. And I'll show you how we can fix that so you can set yourself up for success here in a moment. But understanding carrying capacity is critical for your operations. Everywhere I go, always said they have a rule of thumb on carrying capacity. Kind of heard this morning, stocking rate at 1 animal per hectare on that study, or 2 animals per hectare. This is an example. One of my colleagues, this is his place, 120 acres in south central Oklahoma. Rule of thumb is 1 cow per 10 acres. So this is 120 acres. So that tells me my rule of thumb, I should be able to run 12 head on that, right? That tell me everything I need to know. Well, there's an aerial of his place. It's covered in trees. It's in the Arbuckle Mountains, so it's got rock outcrops everywhere. The only place he's got open pasture with good grass is up here, and absolutely no water. Actually, whenever Devlin calculated his carrying capacity on this, looking at grazable acres, not total number of acres he owned, just the grazable acres, he was less than two cows. But how many of us are guilty of using that rule of thumb because everybody else does it? I love this one. I was actually teaching a grazing class in San Marcos, and a university professor, we were out at his ranch, and this is exactly how he calculated his carrying capacity. And the next day, whenever I was teaching, I put this up there, and I was like, Ken, I put this up here for you because you are messing up. But here, that same 120 acres, his bank note is $15,000. He estimates his calves are worth $1,000 at weaning. So to cover that, he's got to run 15 head of cows. Is that realistic? What's he going to do to his property over time? It's going to keep going down and going down. This is what's happened to our livestock industry. I see this as I'm driving up and down the roads all the time. I actually have a neighbor. He's told me a couple years ago, I told him he needed to sell animals because he kept getting over on me. He goes, I can't. My wife said, well, what does he mean he can't? And I was like, he can't because the bank owns him. If he takes him to the sale barn, he doesn't get a check. Not a very good businessman. Here's another example. This is one of our ranches. This is in 2003. This is 85 acres. About 75 acres of grazable land. So do I still have my carrying capacity based on 2003? How many of you guys carrying capacity is based on what your dad did or your grandpa did? Happens a lot. Well, in 2022, this is the same property, but it's changed quite a bit. County came in, expanded the road, took 5 acres from us. Oil field got built, took 5 acres. We also had a lot of brush encroachment. Not the good kind of brush. This is honey locust, which greatly limits the amount of grazing that the animals, especially cattle, will do around those trees because they don't want to get poked. So we went from 75 grazable acres down to about 55 grazable acres in that 19 years. How does that affect my carrying capacity? How many of you guys' cows are the same size that your dad's or your grandpa's cows were? They're not. 1950, the average cow size was 1,000 pounds. Today, the average cow size is closer to 1,350. And we run the same number of head. We can't. So this is how we calculate carrying capacity. I'm not going into a deep example of how you do it, but I wanted you to see how we do this. Because we've realized in our classes that we spend a lot of time on this. Because a lot of people struggle with it. And this is just a baseline to get you started. But it is grazable acres. Your forage production. This is the one that holds most people up, is understanding how much production you actually have. Your utilization rate. This is your management decision. How much of that forage am I taking off with my animals? How much of it do I want to trample? To leave residual out there to cover the soil. This is all your decision as a manager. And then your demand from your livestock. So once we have that carrying capacity figured out, our next step, and we use this as stocking rate. This is our buffer for those dry years. If my carrying capacity is 100 animals, do I want to put 100 animals on my land resources? Or is my stocking rate 90%, 80%? Or if I've got every one of those cows named, and I can't find, I say my genetics are better than anybody else's in the country, and I'm not selling any of my animals, maybe my stocking rate's 50% or 60%. So on those years I have abundant grass, I have an opportunity to bring in another enterprise, maybe stockers or a lease program to make me more profitable. But as a manager, you need to think about these. I'll talk about each one of those here in a minute, but your stocking rate should never exceed your carrying capacity. Again, carrying capacity is what your animals or your land will support. The stocking rate is what your comfort zone or your comfort level or your risk aversion in that. And always manage your stocking rate proactively. Even your carrying capacity changes year to year. So you ought to be calculating it year to year. I calculate mine on a pasture by pasture basis because it will change if you get to that detail. A good rule of thumb is, or a simple assessment, for every month that you're feeding hay, 8.3% overstocked. Unless you are planning to feed hay. Work with a lot of people that no matter what, they're going to feed hay for two months out of the year or 3 months. Factor that in. But if you want to get rid of some of those high input costs, which hay is, I can factor that in and get down to a level that my land can support. When we deal with stocking rate, the quality of grazing animals on a given land at a given time is our stocking rate once we start moving to a pasture setting. So I'll talk a little bit about stock density here in a moment, but how much of that animal am I putting on my resources at that time, and how much of the time am I allowing the rest of my pastures to rest or recover is what you need to think about. We want to control. It's controlled by grazing, which is our management decision. Again, we like to tell everybody that's a business decision because that's where the money comes in. Stocking rate is the primary determination for profitability. We can have 100 acres and 1 cow and not set our land back any, but are we very profitable? We want to maximize or optimize that stocking rate to generate as much profit as we can, but we don't want to over-succeed it. We want to stock as many animal units or animals as possible without harming our land. And so it's always a question, if I add an extra 10 head, what's that going to do to my forage base? What's that going to do to my soil? As a manager, you need to be thinking about these things. It can be the primary determination on animal performance. And this is why we back away from production, is because if I can put more animals out, maybe my total herd production is greater than with less animals. I'll show you that here in just a moment. But we never want to succeed or exceed that carrying capacity that we've calculated for ourselves. The performance of any individual animal will always decline as the stocking rate increases. The more pressure we put on, the lower our performance of our livestock is going to be. Here's a great graph to show that. This is one of Jim Garrish's slides. He didn't make the main part of this slide. Agronomist did. But what he looked at is as your performance is always high with a lower stocking rate. And as your stocking rate increases, your performance will go down. But whenever you start putting it on that per head basis versus per gain basis, that gain per acre is this green line. And so our idea would be to maximize where those two cross. And that's where we want our stocking rate to be. But if you put economics behind it, it's actually at the peak. Because we can actually generate more pounds of beef per acre without harming our soil, as long as we're staying below that carrying capacity. So we say plan and graze adaptively. I love the story. I was with Wayne Knight, who's with HMI. HMI's founder was good friends with Alan Savory. And the story was Alan was in South Africa at a big conference. They said there was over 1,000 growers there listening to him. And he had one guy, big rancher, came up and was like, I'm following everything you said to a T. I went home and I done 365 pastures. I move my cattle every day, and you've ruined my herd. And Alan's like, you done that because you didn't listen to me. I told you to be adaptive. You're grazing phase 3 plants, mature plants year round. What you should be doing is, as you're grazing, and I'm getting out 30, 40 days, and my first pasture has recovered, come back to it. That's the adaptive thing. We're not prescriptive. We're not following a pattern. We're following what our plants what our pastures are telling us to do. And so this is where that observation comes in key for your management, is observing actually what's going on. And again, work with nature. I don't want to butt heads with my mother-in-law because I'm going to lose every time. I don't want to butt heads with Mother Nature. I'm going to lose eventually. Make her your partner. Principles over practices. Follow those 6 soil health principles to make your management decisions. There's lots of different grazing systems out there. And in our class, we talk about all of them. You know, the amp grazing, mid grazing, total grazing. They're all great tools. Use them as a tool, not a system. Use them at the right times of the year. Observation over habit. Don't go out and do it just because I've always done it this way. Observe what's going on and make your decision based on what you're observing in the pasture or with your livestock. Practicality over paradigms. A lot of us have lots of paradigms. We need to challenge those paradigms. And whenever Butch took our class, I know he texted me later on, a couple of weeks later, and he told me the greatest thing he got out of the class was the emphasis of time. You're an adaptive grazer. Managing time is essential to regenerative and profitable grazing. And I know you'll hear about it this afternoon in the panel discussion, because we'll talk a little bit about moving livestock. But one of the biggest hurdles I have with people in our class is they say, we don't have time to do this. I would say you probably don't have time to not do it because you don't think about what you don't have to do. We change the animal behavior if we're adaptively grazing. They're not the same herd that you started with. They train, cows, especially cattle, will train and be adaptive to what you're doing fairly quick. I've seen it within just a few days that they figure out what you're doing and they're standing there waiting on you. Even if you're only moving every 3 or 4 days, they're ready to go. They're telling you. You can listen to them. They can tell you whenever it's time to move. And to me as a scientist, this one here holds so much to me because this tells the story of, as a good manager, especially a good grazer, what I want to do. And this is a research from 1953 that's been overlooked a lot. Anytime that we overgraze our plants or take too much forage off of it, we're diminishing our root system. If we take anything more than 50%, we're diminishing our roots by a little bit. If we take more than 50%, for that plant to start to regrow new leaves, it's having to pull carbohydrates from that stored root reserve. And as it does, those roots start to die off. And so as I drive across the U.S. and look out in pastures and I see this short, stubby grass that whenever it gets dry for just a few days, it starts to brown up, it's all to do with the roots. We've taken away that plant's ability to survive. And on really bad drought years, we actually start killing plants. We can do this through our grazing and encourage deep, vibrant root systems. I cut hay. I actually cut hay high because I mimic how I would graze. And in 2 years, I've doubled my hay production, my forage production, by just not taking as much off the top. And that's astounding because my production in my fields is 3 times higher than the county, what the USDA says or the NRCS says my best production should be. That's profit for me. The other big one is don't be afraid to waste grass. I grew up running stockers, and my dad taught me that if there was any grass left out there, I've wasted it. That's not the case because we also need to feed those livestock below ground, those microbes. So just in closing here, some strategies I want to leave you with is adjust stocking rate with your carrying capacity. And again, you need to be observing, recalculating that carrying capacity probably on a yearly basis. Like I said, I do mine multiple times a year because I want to look for those opportunities that I could generate more income. Or if I know it's going to get dry, maybe it's time for me to do pull some animals in or sell some. Build flexibility into your stocking rate. That way, when those droughts do occur, you're ready for it. You've got more forage out there to prolong your grazing. Plan your grazing activities. If you're not planning, you're shooting from the hip. And shooting from the hip, you never, hardly ever hit the target. So plan what you're doing. And then graze adaptively. Minimize the time you're in a pasture. So I got into a couple months ago, I taught a couple classes in Oklahoma and Arkansas, had a lot of friends was talking to me, and I realized a lot of people didn't understand the difference between overgrazing and overstocking. And so I dove into the literature and wrote a paper on what's the difference. And I, as a scientist, I looked at it on a plant level. And it is astounding to me what little I knew about plant physiology with pasture plants. I know a lot about trees because that was my line of work. But whenever we overgraze, and overgraze is if I've allow the animal to take a bite, and that plant starts to regrow and that animal can come back and take that bite again, that is technically overgrazing. Because I'm making that plant use stored carbohydrates. And repeated overgrazing will start diminishing your plant, your root system, and your overall health of the plant, and make it more susceptible to diseases, insects, and if it's continuously overgrazed, you'll lose that plant species. We see it a lot in the native pastures where big blue and switchgrass and gamagrass no longer exist because they were the ice cream plants that the animals always went back to. But what got me interested was I learned through this lit review how the plant goes through a hormone imbalance. Just like we do, as humans, animals do. And as that plant goes through a hormone imbalance, it affects its performance. And it takes a long time for it to correct itself. And so anytime we're overgrazing, we're putting more and more pressure on that plant, individual plants in our pastures. Graze only a portion of those leaves. Like Ted said, you want to leave that residual. You want that trampling. There's a lot of benefits to that. Certain times of the year, especially if you're trying to put weight on animals, we're top grazing because that's the highest quality. We're able to put more weight on the animals quicker if we're not making them eat more rank material. If it's cows, maybe we make them eat more, but we're doing it in a timed box. So we're not allowing that plant to start regrowing while the animals are there. And then the biggest key to grazing is the recovery. I was taught, and I've heard it today, rest. I want to challenge you, if you've got a warm season perennial and you're grazing in the winter time while they're dormant, is there any recovery occurring? There's not. So we look at recovery. We want that plant to recover to a late stage 2 or phase 2 plant, or even a phase 3, so that plant has loaded that root system full of carbohydrates to use when it's needed later on in the year. And as you see, these 7 bullet points are pretty simple to follow. So it's not hard to do. It's just getting in the right mindset to understand what you need to be, those principles that you need to be following. So again, it's not just about the grazing to be successful. To me, the grazing part of it's pretty simple. We need that planning, the carrying capacity, the stocking rate, the infrastructure. That's a huge one for most folks, is understanding infrastructure need. Again, go back to what do you currently have? Use what you got. And then your desired outcomes. If you don't have a goal of every grazing event, you're missing an opportunity. Follow those principles. Our 4 key principles is timing, intensity, frequency, and duration of the grazes. You need to keep those in the back of your mind as you're planning your grazing activities. And then your practices is your rest, recovery, stock density. We'll talk a lot more about stock density in the panel this afternoon, and then grazing intensity.